It was the kind of night that seemed to trap every sound and turn every mile of road into an echo chamber. The moon hung low and distorted behind thick clouds, like a bloated eye watching the interstate. I'd been driving for hours, staring into that empty stretch of two-lane highway. My radio had faded out of range, and in its place came a low, rhythmic buzzing. That's when I saw him. A lone figure standing just beyond the reach of my high beams. His outline was hazy, as if he were shifting somehow, like he was caught between one reality and another. I should have just kept going, but fatigue and some twisted sense of curiosity got the better of me. I slowed down, letting the car crawl forward. I cracked the window and called out, "Need a ride?" No response. He just stood there, silent and still. I felt an odd chill skitter up my spine, but before I could think it over, he nodded, almost mechanically. He opened the door without a sound and slid in. He didn't make a move to buckle his seatbelt, and I could feel him staring at me, even though I hadn't dared to look at him directly. "Where you headed?" I asked, breaking the silence. He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering the question. Then he spoke, and his voice was something strange, raspy and cold, as if it came from a mouth that hadn't been used to speak in a very long time. "Just a bit further up the road," he replied. I nodded and pressed on the gas, glad to have a direction at least. His words were like nails scraping against metal, a grating sound that somehow resonated in the back of my skull. He didn't say much after that. Occasionally I'd catch him watching me, but every time I glanced over, he would turn his gaze back to the road. And then, maybe 10 minutes in, he broke the silence again. "Do you know the area?" "Not really," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just passing through." "Have you ever felt that sensation," he asked slowly, "of being pulled towards something?" I hesitated. "Like a place?" "No. Like a memory," he whispered, his voice curling around the words like smoke. "A memory that's not yours." My hands tightened on the wheel and I forced a laugh. "Can't say I have. That's something you experience a lot." He nodded slowly, his face still shadowed. "Yes, I suppose you could say that, but it's less of an experience and more of an awakening." His words sent a prickling down my neck. I tried to brush it off, but the air in the car had turned thick and oppressive. It was hard to breathe, as if the very air was infected by his words. Then, out of nowhere, he started muttering to himself, speaking in some language I didn't recognize. It was guttural, heavy, like the sound of stones grinding together. Every so often he'd stop, a long silence stretching between his whispers. And each time he paused, the radio's buzzing would grow louder, filling the car with that strange static. I glanced at him, and I swear his skin looked wrong, pale, almost translucent, with dark veins twisting beneath the surface. I could have sworn he hadn't looked like that when he got in, but then again, I hadn't looked directly at him. Now it felt impossible to look away. "You know," he said, and his voice cut through the static like a knife, "we're all just vessels, carrying the past. Sometimes the past finds its way back. Sometimes it tries to relive itself." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just drove, gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. The buzzing in the radio was now more than just a sound, it was vibrating through my bones. It felt like something was crawling inside my head, filling my thoughts with static. The figure shifted beside me, moving closer. His eyes glinted with something that looked like recognition, as if he knew me. Not the way you know a friend, but as if he was familiar with every dark thought, every hidden fear I'd ever had. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked. "The memory that isn't yours. The echo." "What? What do you mean?" I managed to stammer. He leaned in close, his breath cold against my neck. "You've been here before," he said, his voice almost a growl. "In another life. You know what comes next." A flash of something stirred in my mind. A road. This road stretching endlessly under a sky just like this one, in a car that wasn't quite my own, and a passenger, a stranger in the seat beside me. "You know what happens when you reach the end of this road," he whispered. A creeping sense of terror gripped me. I tried to focus, but the memory twisted and blurred, as if I were peering through a fog. I was driving, always driving, with him beside me. And each time I reached the end of the road, something terrible happened, something I couldn't quite remember, yet it haunted me like a forgotten nightmare. I could barely see the road anymore, the static now blinding me. My hands were no longer my own. I could feel him guiding them, pulling me forward deeper into the memory. "What are you?" I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. His lips curved into a smile, a hollow, empty thing. "I am you," he said, "and I am everyone who has ever driven this road. I am the last passenger, the memory that never fades." I looked over, and his face had shifted again, taking on the shape of something familiar, something horrifyingly familiar. It was my face, twisted and worn, staring back at me with eyes that held centuries of pain. As I looked into those eyes, a dark realization washed over me. This wasn't just a hitchhiker. This was me, a part of me, or maybe a part of every driver who had ever passed this way. A piece of the road itself, haunting every soul who dared to drive it alone at night. In the split second that followed, the car spun off the road, tires skidding against gravel. I braced myself, expecting impact, but instead, the world went silent, like the pause before a final breath. When I opened my eyes, I was alone on the highway, my car still idling. I looked over, but the passenger seat was empty, as if he had never been there. But I knew. Deep down, I knew he was still there, somewhere waiting. The radio buzzed to life again, filling the car with that familiar static. And as I pulled back onto the road, I knew that one day, on another night, I'd see him again. I've always loved exploring abandoned places. When I heard about Starlight Amusement Park, a forgotten park on the city's edge, I knew I had to see it. Locals claimed it was haunted by the spirits of those who never left. I thought it was just a legend, until I went myself. It was nearly dusk when I arrived. The park was a skeleton of what it once was: rusted rides, crumbling ticket booths, and a Ferris wheel that creaked in the wind. Though it stood deathly still. I moved past old food stalls and ticket stubs that littered the ground, making my way toward the funhouse, drawn by its ominous clown face grinning down at the entrance. Inside, the air was stale, and cracked mirrors lined the walls, each one reflecting a distorted version of me. As I walked deeper into the funhouse, I started to hear faint music, a warped tune that echoed through the hallways. It grew louder with each step, almost like a heartbeat. I turned a corner and froze. In the dim light, an old mannequin stood in front of a mirror, arms stretched out as if beckoning me closer. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly backed away, but the path I'd entered from had disappeared. I couldn't make sense of it. The layout had somehow shifted. Panicked, I tried to find my way out, but every turn led to another distorted mirror, each reflection growing more twisted and unnatural. I stopped in front of one mirror, my heart pounding, when my reflection blinked. I stumbled back, but the reflection remained, its eyes locked onto mine with a sinister grin. I ran, pushing through the maze until I finally found an exit door. I burst out only to stop short. The park was lit up now, every ride glowing with a strange golden light. The Ferris wheel turned slowly, and faint laughter echoed through the air. People were walking around, but something was wrong. They wore old-fashioned clothes, their faces expressionless, eyes staring straight ahead, ignoring me entirely. Then I noticed her, a little girl in a torn dress, standing by the carousel, staring right at me. Her face was blank, but her eyes seemed to recognize me. She raised a hand, pointing in my direction. "You don't belong here." The lights flickered, and in an instant, everything went dark. I was alone again, the silence swallowing me whole. I turned, heart racing, desperate to escape. When I finally reached the gate, I threw myself over, landing hard on the other side. Catching my breath, I looked back one last time at the Ferris wheel. I could swear, in one of the carriages, the little girl was still there, watching me. I left Starlight Park that night, and I haven't gone back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that faint, scratchy music echoing in the back of my mind, a reminder of the park that never truly let me go. It started as an ordinary Saturday night adventure with my friends. We'd been exploring abandoned places around the city for months, searching for something to break up the monotony of our lives. That night, we set our sights on an old, crumbling hospital on the outskirts of town. A place rumored to have been closed for decades. No one knew much about it. The official records were vague, almost as if it hadn't existed at all. The hospital was covered in ivy and graffiti, with shattered windows and rusted doors barely hanging on by their hinges. Stepping inside was like entering a different world, musty, dark, and filled with the echo of our footsteps. We passed through rooms that still had old, dust-covered beds and half-broken wheelchairs, all bathed in the cold glow of our flashlights. The air was thick, damp, and almost watchful. As we moved deeper into the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. My friends joked around, calling out each other's names and pretending to hear footsteps, but I couldn't join in. Every corner we turned felt like it hid something just out of sight, something that would step out the second our backs were turned. I tried to brush it off, convinced that I was just letting the dark get to me. We found a hallway, its walls lined with strange symbols painted in a dark, faded red. They didn't look like the usual graffiti, more like symbols from some ritual, carefully drawn and perfectly spaced. My friend Sarah leaned in closer, squinting at one of the symbols, when suddenly our flashlights flickered and the room plunged into darkness. For a brief second, I thought it was a power surge or something with the batteries. But then, in the pitch black, we heard it. A shuffling sound just a few feet away. It was subtle at first, like the drag of something heavy against the floor, slowly inching toward us. The lights came back on, and we all froze. There, at the end of the hall, was a figure, a shadowy outline that didn't quite make sense. It was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long, almost spider-like. Its head was tilted unnaturally to the side, and I could swear I saw it twitch, just slightly, as if it was deciding whether to approach us. Sarah whispered, "Run," but we couldn't move. The figure began to sway, slowly shifting from one side to the other, as if it was testing our reactions. Then, in one swift, jerking motion, it took a step forward. That was enough. We bolted, scrambling back down the hallway through a maze of rooms that all looked the same in our panic. Doors we'd entered easily before seemed to slam shut as we passed, forcing us deeper and deeper into the hospital, as if it was steering us somewhere we didn't want to go. We ended up in a large, empty room. An old surgical theater, with rows of seats circling a rusted metal table in the center. Our flashlights barely reached the edges, casting strange, flickering shadows. We all huddled close, gasping for air, trying to gather ourselves. Then, one by one, the shadows started to move, not like they were shifting with our lights, but like they were crawling, stretching themselves out, creeping toward us. It wasn't just one shadow. It was dozens, and they seemed to spill out of the walls, filling every corner until there was nowhere left to look that wasn't covered by their dark, writhing shapes. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give out. We stood there, transfixed, as the shadows closed in, almost as if they were waiting for us to make a move. I don't know who broke the silence. Maybe it was me, maybe it was someone else. But suddenly we were all screaming, stumbling over each other as we scrambled to find the door. We burst out into the hallway, running as fast as we could. The shuffling sound returned, only now it was louder, closer. We didn't dare look back. By some miracle, we made it to the exit, crashing out of the building and into the cool night air. We kept running until we reached our cars, only stopping once we were safely locked inside. As we sat there, catching our breath, I turned back to look at the hospital, expecting to see that shadowy figure in one of the windows. But the building just stood there, silent and empty, as if mocking us. We never spoke about it after that night. Whenever one of us tried to bring it up, someone else would cut them off. But I can still feel it. The heaviness, the watching presence. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear that slow, dragging shuffle just outside my door. It started as a dare. My friends and I had heard about the old, abandoned Line 13 subway station, a stop built in the 1950s, but abandoned after a series of unexplained accidents. Rumors claimed that those who entered never returned, but I never believed in urban legends. So, when my friends challenged me to explore it, I took them up on it. I slipped through the fenced-off entrance late at night, armed with only my flashlight. The air inside was thick, stale, and every sound echoed endlessly. As I descended the stairs, my footsteps seemed to get swallowed up by an unnatural silence. The graffiti-covered walls grew darker and colder the further I went. My flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to move just out of view. I finally reached the platform. The tracks stretched into darkness on either side, and a single, ancient subway car sat on the tracks, abandoned and still. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, maybe a few rats or some graffiti, but I certainly wasn't expecting the train car to feel so alive. The windows were dark, but it felt like something was watching me from inside. I walked along the platform, keeping my eyes on the train. That's when I heard it, a faint, metallic clanking echoing from somewhere inside the car. My flashlight flickered again, and for a second, I saw something or someone in one of the windows. It was just a shape, shadowy, with eyes that gleamed in the dark. The figure vanished before I could get a closer look, but a cold dread settled over me. I should have left then, but curiosity got the best of me. I stepped onto the train car, feeling the ground sway slightly beneath me. The inside was dim, with seats covered in grime and old, yellowed newspapers scattered across the floor. A distant, rhythmic tapping sound echoed through the car, though I couldn't see its source. As I moved further inside, the doors suddenly hissed shut behind me. My heart jumped, and I turned to push them open, but they wouldn't budge. Then the train lurched, as if it were about to start moving. Panic surged through me. I banged on the doors, calling out, but there was only silence. The lights overhead flickered to life, casting a sickly, yellow glow across the car. I turned, and there they were, passengers filling every seat. Their heads were lowered, faces shadowed, clothes outdated by decades. None of them moved, yet I could feel their eyes on me, waiting. Then, one by one, they began to raise their heads. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow and staring, fixed on me with expressions twisted into strange, unnatural smiles. I stumbled back, the doors finally hissing open behind me. I bolted out, not daring to look back as I sprinted up the stairs and out of the station. As I reached the street, I glanced back into the darkness. The platform was empty, the subway car gone as if it had never been there at all. But ever since that night, I can still hear the faint, rhythmic tapping in quiet moments, a reminder that some places aren't meant to be disturbed. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. I had the house to myself for the weekend while my parents went away for a wedding. It was my first time being completely alone in the house, and at first I was excited. No one to bother me, no rules, just peace and quiet. But as the hours passed, I began to feel off. The house is old, built in the 1930s with creaky floors and windows that rattle in the wind. My parents always used to joke about how alive the house felt, but I never thought much of it. I'd grown used to the odd creaks and groans that came with an old house, especially at night. But something about being alone made those noises different, more intense. The first night wasn't too bad. I spent the evening binge watching TV shows and snacking on junk food. But by the time I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to just being nervous, but then as I lay there in the dark, I heard something. A knock, soft, almost inaudible, coming from the living room. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. It was past midnight, and there was no one supposed to be here. I told myself it was the wind, maybe the old house settling, but the knock came again. This time louder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, my eyes scanning the darkness. My phone was charging on the nightstand, and I reached for it, fingers trembling. I was about to call my parents to ask if they'd forgotten something, or to just hear a familiar voice, but I stopped myself. It wasn't like I could just call them every time I heard a noise. This was my chance to prove that I could handle being alone. I took a deep breath and slowly got out of bed, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The house felt colder now, the air heavy with silence. I stepped out of my room and into the hallway, my bare feet silently padding against the wooden floor. The knock came again, this time louder, as if someone or something was at the front door. I tiptoed toward the stairs, my heart racing. The living room was dark, just a faint glow coming from the kitchen. As I neared the front door, the knocking stopped. I froze at the base of the stairs, listening. There was nothing. No more knocking, no footsteps, just silence. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was nothing. But as I turned to walk back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow. It was fleeting, but I saw it clearly in the dim light, a figure, tall and thin, standing just outside the front door. I gasped and stumbled back, my pulse skyrocketing. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, the coldness of its stare. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to go anywhere near that door. But I couldn't stay frozen in place forever. I backed away, my mind racing. Was I just seeing things? My eyes were playing tricks on me, right? But then I heard it, a soft voice. It was barely audible, but I could make out the words. Let me in. Annulled. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure no one was outside. I hadn't seen anyone come to the door when I glanced out earlier, and my phone showed no missed calls. Yet the voice, it sounded like it was coming from right outside the door. I backed up slowly, my legs shaking. I needed to do something. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy book off the shelf, and crept back to the door, holding it in front of me like some kind of weapon. I reached for the doorknob, hesitated, and then yanked the door open. No one was there, just the empty porch, lit by a single, flickering light. The cold air rushed in, and I could see my breath in the night air. But the doorframe was empty. There was no one around. Relieved but still shaken, I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me. But as I turned back to the living room, something caught my eye. A faint imprint, like the shape of a hand, pressed into the condensation on the glass of the door. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. It was like someone had been standing right there, watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, the lights on, listening for any more sounds. The house felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. When my parents came home the next day, they found me exhausted and on edge. I told them what happened, but they just laughed it off, said I was probably hearing things. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And ever since that night, the house has felt different. The knocking hasn't stopped. It's softer now, less frequent. But every time I'm alone, I hear it. I always check the door, but I've never found anyone. Still, I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, waiting for me to open that door again. And sometimes, when the house is perfectly still, I hear that voice again, a whisper just below the threshold of hearing. Let me in. I've always hated being home alone. There's something unsettling about the silence, the way it stretches around you, amplifying every little creak and groan of the house. But when my parents went away for the weekend, I thought I could handle it. I was wrong. The first night was fine. I spent it watching movies, eating too much junk food, and texting my friends. But as the hours passed, the house started to feel bigger, emptier. It wasn't until I went to bed that I began to feel the unease creeping in. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakable, coming from downstairs. My heart skipped. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then the footsteps came again. And this time they were closer. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound was clear, the creak of the floorboards downstairs unmistakable. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. I was alone. My parents weren't due back until Sunday evening. Maybe it was an animal? The house had always had its odd quirks. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became someone was downstairs. My mind raced with thoughts of burglars or worse. I reached for my phone, but I froze. If I called the police, they'd think I was overreacting. Still, I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and crept down the stairs as quietly as I could, holding my breath with every step. I reached the bottom of the staircase, peering into the living room. It was empty. The front door was locked, the windows shut tight. But something was off. The kitchen light was on. It hadn't been before. I hadn't turned it on. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stood there for a moment, the silence pressing in around me. Then, from the kitchen, I heard a noise of faint scraping, like something dragging across the floor. My pulse quickened. I wasn't imagining this. Someone or something was in my house. I stepped forward, my bat tight in my grip, moving slowly toward the kitchen. But as I reached the doorway, the noise stopped. I stood frozen, listening for any sign of movement, but the house was eerily still. Then I heard a voice. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It came from the kitchen. You can't hide forever. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone. Someone was here. But who? And why were they whispering like that? My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. I couldn't stay in the open. I needed a plan, a way to get out of the house. I turned to run back upstairs, but as I did, I caught sight of something through the hallway mirror. A figure, tall and thin, standing in the doorway of the living room, just watching me. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't make out any features. My breath hitched, and before I could react, the figure stepped back into the shadow of the hallway. Gone. Panic surged through me. I ran to the back door, but it was locked. I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were shut too. I was trapped. I stumbled back into the living room, my mind spinning. What should I do? Call the police? Run outside and try to get help? But there was nothing. The house felt too big, too empty. Every room felt like a potential hiding spot for whoever was in here with me. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard it again. A whisper, faint but clear. "Why did you run?" I spun around, bat raised, heart pounding. But the room was empty. No figure, no movement, just the soft hum of the refrigerator. I stood there, frozen in place, unable to move. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The house was still, the silence heavy around me. My mind screamed for me to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to move. It was like the house had become a maze, and every path led me back to the same place nowhere. I finally mustered the courage to run for the front door. I tore through the house, nearly tripping over my own feet. The front door was locked, but this time I had the key. My hand trembled as I fumbled with the lock, finally throwing the door open. The cool night air hit me like a wave, and I stepped outside, panting. I didn't look back. I ran to the neighbor's house, knocking frantically. They let me in, and I stayed there, terrified and shaken, unable to sleep. When my parents finally came home, they found the house untouched. No signs of break-ins, no broken windows, no mess. Everything was exactly as they had left it. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear that soft whisper. "Why did you run?" Echoing in my mind. And I wonder if whatever was in that house is still there, waiting for me to come back. I was thrilled to finally have the house to myself. My parents were away, and I could stay up late, watch horror movies, and eat all the junk food I wanted. But around midnight, I started feeling on edge. It was too quiet. Every creak of the house seemed amplified, and shadows seemed to stretch farther than usual. I shook it off, grabbed some popcorn, and settled in to watch a movie. Halfway through, though, I heard something odd, a soft shuffling sound coming from the hallway. I paused the movie, holding my breath, but the sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing and tried to get back to the movie. But then I heard it again, louder this time, like footsteps. I froze, heart racing. The house was locked. I had checked all the doors and windows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was in the house. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed down the hallway. The lights were off, but I could see a faint glow coming from under the door to my parents' bedroom, which I knew I'd turned off earlier. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. The room was empty. But as I was about to close the door, I noticed something chilling. The bed covers were slightly pulled back, like someone had just gotten up. I backed out, heart pounding, and went to lock myself in my room. But as I turned, I heard a soft whisper from behind me. "Are you alone?" I spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper echoed in my mind, making my skin crawl. I rushed to my room, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night, too terrified to close my eyes. When my parents came home the next day, they found the house exactly as they'd left it. But I know what I heard, what I saw. And now, every time I'm alone, I can't help but wonder if something or someone is still there, waiting in the dark. A few weeks ago, I found an old, leather-bound journal in a box of things left in my attic by the house's previous owner. I'd been living here for months, and I hadn't noticed it before. The journal was plain but worn, as if it had been carried around a long time. I was curious, so I opened it. The first few pages were blank, except for a date in the corner, June 3rd. It was that day's date. I chalked it up to coincidence and kept reading, but as I flipped the pages, I noticed something strange. On the next page, written in messy scrawl, was the phrase, "You're not alone." I felt a chill, but I pushed it aside, assuming it was just someone's forgotten, cryptic musings. The following day, I picked it up again, and to my shock, there was new writing. "You'll hear footsteps tonight. Don't follow them." I stared at the page, heart pounding. The handwriting matched the entry from before, but I knew I hadn't written it. My first thought was that someone was messing with me, though I couldn't imagine how. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks and put the journal away. That night, around midnight, I heard faint footsteps upstairs, slow, measured steps moving from room to room. I was alone in the house, and every instinct screamed at me to hide. The journal's warning echoed in my mind, and I stayed frozen in my bed, clutching the covers. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and I lay awake until dawn. The next morning, trembling, I opened the journal again. A fresh message waited on the page. "You did well. Now don't leave the house tonight." My heart raced as I read the words, feeling an irrational urge to obey. By this point, the journal's eerie instructions had me completely on edge. I tried throwing it away, even burning it, but each time I'd find it back on my nightstand, seemingly untouched. The entries continued. Some were short, cryptic commands, "Don't turn around." Others were more detailed, unsettling descriptions of things I'd see throughout the day. A broken cup, a missed call, a stranger who'd smile but never speak. Everything the journal described would come true in chilling accuracy. One night, the journal left a different message: "Do not enter the basement." I'd always avoided it. Anyway, a creepy, narrow space with shelves of dust-covered jars and tools. But with this new warning, my curiosity got the better of me. I opened the basement door and flicked on the light, my heart hammering. As I took the first step, I noticed something odd on the wall, a smear of what looked like dirt, leading down the stairs. Slowly, I followed it, each step creaking under my weight. At the bottom, the smear led to an old, dusty mirror leaned against the wall, and that's when I saw it. There, in the reflection, stood a figure, a shadowy version of myself, staring back, its eyes empty and hollow. I staggered back, feeling an overwhelming dread as the figure raised its hand, mimicking my movements. I turned to run, but before I could take a step, the reflection whispered, "Welcome home." The next morning, I found one last entry in the journal: "You belong here now." The journal hasn't written anything since. Every morning I wake up hoping I'll find a new message that will tell me how to escape. But I think I already know the truth. This house doesn't want me to leave. And sometimes in the silence, I still hear the faint echo of footsteps, as if it's reminding me that I can't ever leave. My friend David disappeared last year, and no one's been able to explain it. I still replay that night over and over, wondering if there was something I could have done to stop it, or if there was any way I could have ever understood it. It was a cold November night. We were heading home from a small party in the next town, one of those quiet get-togethers where everyone knew each other. David had been acting strange all night, restless, distracted. On the drive back, he was quiet, staring out the window as the dark countryside blurred past. We took a shortcut, a winding road through dense woods that stretched for miles. It was so quiet out there that night, with no other cars, no lights, not even the usual sounds of animals or rustling leaves. Just this eerie, dead silence that settled over everything. And then, out of nowhere, David told me to pull over, said he needed to get some air. The request caught me off guard. We were miles from the nearest house with nothing but trees around us. I asked him if he was feeling all right, but he just nodded and insisted. So I pulled over. David stepped out, leaving his door open, and walked a few paces into the field by the road, staring out into the dark. I watched him from the car, a little uneasy. Something about the way he was standing. The way he kept his hands in his pockets and wouldn't turn around. I don't know. It just felt wrong. After a minute, I rolled down the window and called out, "David, everything all right?" He didn't answer. He didn't even look back. He just stood there, looking into the distance as if he saw something I couldn't see. Then he did something that still haunts me. He whispered something. At least I think he did. The words were too soft for me to make out, but I swear I saw his lips move. It was like he was having a conversation with someone or something that wasn't there. I called his name again, louder this time, and finally he turned around, but there was this look on his face I'd never seen before. A kind of vacant expression, like he wasn't really seeing me, just looking through me. Then he turned back to the field and kept walking. I watched him disappear into the shadows of the trees. By now my heart was pounding. I was about to get out and go after him, but something stopped me. The air around me felt thick, heavy, like the quiet itself was pressing down on me, warning me to stay back. I waited, expecting him to come back, or at least to hear his footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves. But there was only silence. I yelled for him, my voice echoing into the emptiness, but there was no answer. Then I heard a strange noise, a faint rustling like someone shifting through the leaves. It was coming from deeper in the woods, far from where David had been. My heart leapt, thinking maybe it was him. I stepped out of the car, but as I moved closer, I realized the noise wasn't quite right. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like something pacing back and forth. I was rooted in place, torn between going in and staying back. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They led off the road into the woods. But the strange part was they weren't David's footprints. They were larger, spaced in a way that didn't look natural, almost like they belonged to something that wasn't used to walking on two legs. I backed away, panic flooding over me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get back in the car and drive. But I couldn't leave without David. I shouted his name one last time, my voice cracking in the cold, dead air. Then, all at once, the footsteps stopped. The silence was absolute, like the whole forest was holding its breath. And then I saw something in the tree's shadow, just at the edge of my vision, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel it staring at me with this quiet intensity, like it was daring me to come closer. I stumbled back into the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I felt like I was being watched, followed, like that shadow was hovering just outside the window. But when I looked back, the woods were empty. No shadow, no footprints, no David. I stayed in the car all night, waiting, terrified of what might happen if I stepped back out into the dark. When the first light of dawn broke, I got out and searched the woods, hoping he'd come back, or that I'd see some sign of him. But there was nothing. Not a single footprint or broken branch to show he'd even been there. Just the strange, empty quiet. They never found David. The police searched for weeks, but there wasn't a single trace of him. No signs of a struggle, no clues. Just gone. His parents couldn't bear it. They moved away a few months after that, but I stayed. I needed answers. Every now and then I go back to that road, standing there where he disappeared, listening to the quiet. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still hear those strange, rhythmic footsteps echoing through the trees. And sometimes, if I listen closely enough, I swear I can hear him, whispering my name from somewhere deep in the darkness, as if he's still out there, waiting for me to follow. And even now, part of me wonders what would have happened if I had. It started 2 weeks ago. Every night around 3 a.m., I'd wake up to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. It was a slow, deliberate tap-tap, as if someone wanted to make sure I was awake. My bedroom is on the second floor, so there's no way anyone could be reaching up there. At first, I thought it was a branch, maybe wind pushing it against the glass. But when I looked, there was nothing there. The tapping continued night after night, always at the same time. Tap, tap. I tried ignoring it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the sound was so clear, so persistent. It seemed to linger in my ears even after it stopped. Then, a few nights ago, I worked up the courage to look outside right when I heard it. Slowly, I crept over to the window, heart pounding. I held my breath and peeked through the blinds. What I saw chilled me to the bone. There, just beyond the glass, was a face staring back at me. It was pale, almost ghostly, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to sink deep into the skull. Its mouth was twisted into an unnatural grin, stretched wide as if it knew something I didn't. And as it stared, its hand reached out, its bony fingers tapping rhythmically against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I stumbled back, too terrified to scream. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting in the corner with the lights on, trying to convince myself it was just a nightmare. But the next morning, I found fingerprints on the glass, long, thin prints that didn't match any hand I'd ever seen. I tried to brush it off as a strange prank, but the tapping came back the following night. This time it was louder, more insistent. Tap, tap. I didn't dare look out again, but I could feel its gaze on me, like it was waiting for me to come closer. Then, last night, the tapping changed. It was no longer a rhythmic tap. Instead, it sounded like scratching, as if claws were dragging across the glass, trying to find a way inside. I lay there frozen, listening as the scratching grew louder, more frantic. This morning I checked the window and found deep grooves etched into the glass, thin lines that ran down the length of the pane. I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to leave, but a darker part wonders what would happen if I opened the window, if I finally let it in. Tonight, I'll find out. It started with a dare. A simple, stupid dare. And now I can't escape the nightmare I brought upon myself. I don't know if it's too late to make it stop, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not alone anymore. The air was damp, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the walls like an unseen presence. My best friend Claire was upstairs with her phone, recording every second of my humiliation. "You won't do it," she'd laughed. "You're all talk." She was wrong. Dead wrong. The dare was simple. Draw the symbols, light the candles, and say the words. Some internet challenge we stumbled across late at night while binging horror videos. Summon the demon of secrets, the site had said. Supposedly the demon wouldn't harm you. It would just show you something no one else could. Sounded harmless enough, right? But I hesitated. Not because I believed in any of it. I mean, I didn't. Not really. But as the chalk scratched against the cold, cracked concrete, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach, like I was digging my own grave. I finished the last stroke of the symbol and sat back on my heels. My breath came out in shallow puffs, the cold biting into my skin. The words were next. I'd rehearsed them upstairs, laughing about how stupid they sounded. But now, they felt heavier, darker. "Reveal your truth," I whispered, then louder, "Reveal your truth." The candles flickered violently. I froze, my eyes darting around the room. "Claire," I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Then the sound came. A low, guttural hum, like a deep vibration in the earth. It reverberated through my chest, rattling my ribs. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into near total darkness. That's when I saw it. The shadow. At first I thought it was just the candlelight playing tricks. But this shadow moved, sliding along the wall and coalescing into a shape. A figure. Taller than any human, its limbs too long, its fingers ending in sharp, jagged points. "You called." It hissed, the voice like nails scraping against glass. My throat went dry. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. I didn't mean to. I stammered. The figure tilted its head, its glowing red eyes narrowing. But you did. It stepped closer, the air growing colder with each movement. What do you want to know? It asked. My mind raced. What had the website said? Ask it a question. Ask it for a secret. I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What's my biggest regret? The shadow's mouth, or what I assumed was its mouth, twisted into a cruel smile. Oh, it rasped. That's easy. Suddenly, the basement wasn't the basement anymore. I was back in my childhood home, standing in the middle of my old bedroom. Everything looked exactly as it had that day, down to the stuffed bear on my bed and the smell of cookies wafting from the kitchen. I heard my younger self laughing in the next room. And then, her voice, my mom's voice. I knew what was coming, and I begged the demon to stop. Please, I screamed. Not this. Anything but this. But it was too late. The door opened, and I watched as my mom walked into the room. She smiled, her face full of warmth. Then the phone rang. I wanted to close my eyes to run, but I was frozen, forced to relive it all. The argument, the slammed door, the words I could never take back. The crash. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the basement, tears streaming down my face. The demon loomed over me, its grin wider now. You wanted the truth, it said, and now you have it. I screamed, clawing at the ground, trying to erase the symbol, but the chalk wouldn't budge. The demon leaned closer, its breath hot against my ear. And now, it whispered, you're mine. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment I thought it was over. Maybe it had left. Maybe it was just a nightmare. But then I felt it. A hand, ice cold and impossibly strong, gripped my wrist. You don't get to leave. It growled, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My skin burned where it touched me, as if its very essence was seeping into my veins. I screamed, thrashing against its grip, but it was like fighting against steel. Then it released me. I fell backward, gasping for air. When I looked up, the demon was gone. Or so I thought. I scrambled to my feet and bolted up the stairs, nearly tripping over my own shaking legs. Claire, I shouted. But the house was silent. Too silent. I found her phone in the living room, still recording. The screen showed me sitting in the basement, the candles flickering, and then nothing. Just static. My voice called out from somewhere within the distortion, echoing over and over. Reveal your truth. And then Claire's scream. My stomach turned as I scrolled through the video, hoping, praying, that she was just messing with me. But she wasn't. The video ended abruptly, cutting to black. That's when I heard it. A low chuckle, coming from the hallway. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming to run. The hallway stretched out before me, impossibly long. At the far end, something moved, a shadow too dark to be natural. Claire. I whispered, my voice barely audible, but deep down I knew it wasn't her. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. With every step, the air grew heavier, colder, until I could see my breath misting in front of me. Did you think it would be that easy? The voice rasped. It sounded different now, deeper, layered, as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. Its smile widened, jagged teeth glinting in the faint light. "I told you." It said, "You're mine." Before I could react, the lights went out again, and I was swallowed by darkness. The last thing I remember was the sound of my own heartbeat, deafening in my ears, as a cold hand closed around my throat. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. Morning light streamed through the curtains, and for a moment I thought it was over. A dream. Just a terrible, vivid nightmare. But then I saw it. The symbol. It was etched into my ceiling, glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat, and beneath it, scrawled in jagged, burnt letters, were 4 words. "You let me in." I don't know how to stop it. I don't know if I can. All I know is I'm not alone anymore. And neither are you. During my 20 years as a sheriff's deputy in central Montana, I've seen plenty of strange things, but nothing comes close to the Nichols case. I wish I could forget it, but I know I never will. It started on a crisp October afternoon in 2017. I was called to assist in the search for a missing family, a father, mother, and their teenage son who had failed to return from a day hike in the Bear Ridge Reserve. Their car was found parked at the trailhead, locked and untouched, but no one had seen them in over 24 hours. I joined a team of rangers and volunteers as we combed through the dense forest. Bear Ridge wasn't the kind of place people got lost easily. The trails were well maintained and mapped. Still, the Nichols family had vanished without a trace. Around sunset, I decided to check a less traveled area, a meadow known as Hart's Hollow. It was marked on maps but rarely visited, mostly because people said the place felt off. I thought it was just superstition. When I reached the meadow, the air changed immediately. It was colder than it should have been, and there was an eerie stillness to the place. No wind, no birds, not even the buzz of insects. The grass, tall and silvered by frost, shimmered in the fading light. That's where I found their first sign. A blue scarf caught on a thorn bush at the edge of the field. It belonged to Rachel Nichols, the mother. I radioed my team and let them know I was onto something, but before I could hear their response, the static cut out. Then I noticed something strange. The center of the field looked wrong. The grass didn't move naturally. It seemed to ripple, like the surface of a lake. I stepped closer, my hand on my holster. My instinct screamed for me to stop, but I pushed forward. That's when I saw them. The Nichols family was standing in the middle of the field, completely still, their backs to me. They weren't huddled together or shouting for help. They were just standing there, perfectly spaced apart, staring at something I couldn't see. "Mr. Nichols," I called out. "Sheriff's Department. Are you all right?" No response. I moved closer, my heart pounding. "Rachel?" Danny, still nothing. They didn't so much as flinch. I was about 20 feet away when I felt it. A vibration under my boots. It wasn't strong, but it was rhythmic, like a pulse. That's when I noticed something even worse. Their heads began to tilt upward, slowly, as if they were watching something rise into the sky. But when I looked, there was nothing there, just a pale blue expanse darkening with the coming night. "Hey," I shouted again. "We need to go. Now." As I stepped forward, I felt the vibration intensify, almost like the ground was alive. Suddenly, the air seemed to thicken, pressing against me like a wall. I couldn't move any closer. The family began to dissolve, not vanish in the blink of an eye, but melt into the air, their bodies fading into translucent wisps of light. I watched in horror as their forms grew fainter and fainter, until all that remained were faint outlines. And then, nothing. I stumbled backward, falling onto the cold grass. The pulse in the ground stopped. The oppressive air lifted, and the field was empty. When I finally managed to radio back to the team, they found me shaking at the edge of the meadow. I told them what I saw, but they didn't believe me. Who would? We searched the field for hours, found nothing but the scarf I'd picked up. The Nichols family was never found. No bodies, no footprints leading away. Nothing. It's like they were plucked out of existence. I haven't been back to Heart's Hollow since, and I don't plan to. Whatever happened to that family wasn't natural. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that faint vibration, feeling that invisible pressure. And sometimes I dream of the field and see shadows where the Nichols family once stood. People go missing in national parks more often than you'd think. Some cases make sense. They get lost, fall, or have an unfortunate run-in with wildlife. But others stick with you. The ones that don't have a clear explanation. The ones that leave you lying awake at night, wondering if you missed something. I'll never forget the summer of 2019. The summer I stopped believing everything could be explained. It started with a call from dispatch about a missing hiker in the Crescent Lake area. The man, Brian Kelser, was 33 and an experienced outdoorsman. He'd told friends he was heading up the Pine Hollow Trail for a solo hike, but never came back. His car was still in the parking lot, keys and wallet inside. I met up with two other rangers, Jenna and Alvarez, and we set out early the next morning. The trail was easy to follow for the first few miles. Dry dirt, scattered rocks, nothing unusual. But then we found something odd. About 5 miles in, the dirt path was abruptly cut by deep gouges in the earth, as if something massive had been dragged through the forest. We followed the marks. They led off the trail and into the thicker part of the woods, where the trees grew so close together it felt like they were swallowing the sunlight. That's when we found the first piece of evidence. A shoe, lying on its side. Brand new, barely scuffed, and it matched the description of the ones Brian had been wearing. Looks like he lost it running. Jenna said, frowning. Running from what? Alvarez asked, scanning the trees. The air felt different here, heavier, colder. We pressed on, following the drag marks and scattered pieces of gear, a torn strap from a backpack, a crumpled water bottle. It wasn't until we reached a small clearing that things really started to feel wrong. The ground was covered in ash, though there were no signs of fire. In the middle of the clearing stood a tree, or at least what I thought was a tree at first. Its bark was pale and smooth, almost like skin, and it pulsed faintly, as if it were alive. Jenna leaned closer to inspect it. "What the hell is this?" she muttered, reaching out to touch it. "Don't," I said quickly, grabbing her arm. I didn't know why, but everything in me screamed not to let her touch it. Then we heard it. A sound like distant whispers carried on the wind, too faint to make out words, but unmistakably human. Alvarez spun around, shining his flashlight into the trees. "Brian, is that you?" he called. No answer. The whispers grew louder, coming from all directions. I swear they weren't just random sounds. They were speaking, repeating the same phrase over and over, though none of us could understand it. That's when we saw the figure. It stood at the edge of the clearing just beyond the tree line, tall, impossibly thin, its limbs bending in ways that didn't seem natural. It didn't move toward us. It just watched. "What is that?" Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. None of us had an answer. We started backing away, but the thing moved, fast and silent, disappearing into the trees. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by a deafening silence. We didn't stick around to see what would happen next. We radioed for backup and made our way back to the trail as quickly as we could. When we returned with a search team later that day, the clearing was gone. The drag marks, the tree, all of it, as if it had never been there. We'd never found Brian Kelser. His case remains open, like so many others. But I know what we saw. Something was out there that day, something not meant to be found. And sometimes, when I'm patrolling alone, I hear those whispers again. Faint, distant, calling me back to the forest. I was never supposed to be here. I keep telling myself that. Maybe if I hadn't decided to wander off the trail, none of this would have happened. But I can't change it now. It started as a solo hike through the dense wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. I'd heard about the area from forums, people raving about how untouched and remote it was. I craved that solitude, a break from the grind of city life. The trail was well marked at first. Towering pines loomed overhead, their tops swaying in the wind, blocking out the sun. Around midday, I spotted an offshoot trail, a narrow, barely visible path winding deeper into the forest. My curiosity got the better of me. It wasn't on any maps I'd downloaded, but the allure of finding something hidden pulled me in. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No rustling leaves, no bird calls, just the sound of my boots crunching on the damp underbrush. That's when I noticed the first oddity, a series of large, perfectly circular impressions in the soil. They were spaced apart, almost like footprints, but much too large for any animal I could think of. My heart raced, but I pressed on. The air grew colder, and a faint mist crept through the trees. The path twisted and turned until I came to a clearing. In the middle of it stood an ancient-looking structure. A low, crumbling stone wall covered in moss and lichen. It seemed so out of place. As I approached, I noticed carvings etched into the stone. Symbols that looked alien, geometric but purposeful. A strange hum filled the air, so faint it was almost imperceptible. It wasn't coming from the structure, though. It felt like it was inside my head. I don't know why, but I reached out and touched one of the carvings. The stone was ice cold, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through my skull. That's when everything went black. I woke up sometime later. Minutes, hours, I don't know. The clearing was gone. The sky was a deep, unnatural shade of red, and the trees around me were warped, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't hear a thing. Not even the sound of my own breathing. Panic set in as I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to change with every turn I took. Paths that were there a moment ago vanished behind me. The ground felt spongy, almost alive, and the mist thickened, swallowing everything beyond a few feet. Then I heard it. A distant, guttural sound. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. A mix of growling and clicking, echoing from the trees. I froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, and my instincts screamed at me to run. I bolted in the opposite direction, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that noise. I didn't stop until I came to another clearing, this one filled with trees that looked burned. Their trunks blackened and split open. In the center was a massive tree stump, its surface carved with the same symbols I'd seen earlier. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it. As I approached, the hum returned, louder than before. My vision blurred, and I felt a pull, like something was dragging me forward. My body wouldn't respond. I couldn't stop myself. The last thing I remember is a blinding flash of light and a deafening roar. When I woke up, I was lying on the main trail, the sun shining through the canopy above. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. My watch said 3 days had passed. I made it back to my car, but I haven't been the same since. Nightmares haunt me every night. Dreams of that red sky, those warped trees, and the thing that was chasing me. Sometimes I wake up with dirt under my nails, the hum still echoing faintly in my ears. I tried reporting what happened, but no one believed me. They said I must have gotten lost and imagined it all. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone out there. Something was watching me, and I can't shake the feeling that it still is. The first time I saw the lights, I thought they were beautiful. The second time, I realized they weren't just floating aimlessly, they were following me. It started as a local curiosity, the kind of story that gets passed around campfires and small-town diners. People in Ridgeway spoke of glowing orbs that appeared in the woods after dark, soft, bluish-green lights that floated silently between the trees. At first, no one thought much of it. Some called it swamp gas. Others said it was fireflies. But then the disappearances began. Hikers, campers, even locals who wandered too deep into the woods after dark, gone without a trace. Their last sightings always came with the same eerie detail, the glowing lights. I didn't believe it. I thought it was just a mix of urban legend and small-town paranoia. As a freelance journalist, I'd covered plenty of strange stories, and this one felt like an easy assignment. A few interviews, some spooky photos, and I'd move on to the next job. But Ridgeway wasn't like other places. I arrived in town just before sunset. The locals were kind enough, but there was a tension in their politeness, as if they were all keeping the same secret. When I asked about the lights, most avoided the question entirely. An elderly man at the diner leaned over and whispered, "If you see them, don't follow them." I laughed nervously, thinking it was just part of the folklore. That night, armed with my flashlight, camera, and notebook, I ventured into the woods. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just the crunch of my boots on the damp earth. After an hour of wandering, I saw them, 3 faint orbs of light hovering a few feet off the ground. They were mesmerizing. The way they glowed was unnatural, almost liquid, as if they were alive. I raised my camera, snapping picture after picture, but the lights didn't appear in any of the photos. I stepped closer, drawn to their eerie beauty, when I noticed something strange. The lights weren't random. They were moving in unison, shifting slowly between the trees. My heart skipped a beat as I realized they were leading me somewhere. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The lights didn't respond, of course. They simply floated deeper into the forest. Against my better judgment, I followed. After what felt like an eternity, I came to a clearing. The lights hovered in the center, forming a perfect circle above the ground. That's when I saw it. A pile of clothes and gear, scattered haphazardly, as if their owners had vanished mid-step. I froze, dread creeping up my spine. The lights began to shift again, swirling faster and faster, until they merged into a single blinding glow. And then I heard it, a soft, melodic humming, almost like a lullaby. I should have run, but my legs wouldn't move. The glow grew brighter, enveloping me in its warmth. For a brief moment I felt an overwhelming sense of peace, until I saw the faces. Dozens of them, flickering in and out of the light. Hollow, sunken eyes stared back at me, their mouths frozen in silent screams. These weren't just lights, they were traps. Suddenly, the humming stopped, the lights dimmed, and the forest was silent again. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back in town. I tried to tell the police, but they didn't believe me. The sheriff just shook his head and muttered, "Another one spooked by the woods." But I know what I saw, and now I can't shake the feeling that the lights aren't done with me. Every night, as I lie in bed, I see faint glimmers in the corner of my vision. Sometimes I hear that humming, growing louder, closer. I didn't believe in curses until I saw the clock strike midnight and a man disappear. What haunts me isn't just that he vanished. It's what I saw in the reflection of the clock's glass just before it happened. The clock arrived at our town's antique shop under mysterious circumstances. No one knew its origin, just that it was donated anonymously. A towering relic of polished mahogany with ornate brass dials. It was beautiful, but something about it made my skin crawl. The shop's owner, Mr. Hall, was the first to notice something strange. Customers would admire the clock, mesmerized by its intricately carved face and the gentle tick of its pendulum. But those who stood too close often said they felt off, dizzy, like the room itself was shifting around them. Then the disappearances began. At first, it seemed coincidental. A woman who'd been seen browsing the shop one afternoon was reported missing by nightfall. A man who stopped in to repair a watch vanished a week later. Each case had no witnesses, no evidence, just silence. I'm not a detective. I run a blog on unsolved mysteries. So when rumors about the clock started swirling, I knew I had to see it for myself. Mr. Hall was reluctant to let me investigate. "It's just a clock," he insisted, though his bloodshot eyes and trembling hands betrayed his fear. That night I convinced him to let me stay in the shop after hours. I wanted to observe the clock in complete silence, away from the bustle of customers. The shop was eerily quiet as I set up my camera and notebook, its shelves of dusty antiques casting long, jagged shadows under the flickering fluorescent light. I sat in front of the clock, its pendulum swinging hypnotically. Midnight was approaching, and with each passing tick, I felt the air grow heavier, colder. When the clock's hands aligned at 12, the shop plunged into complete silence. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to vanish. And then, I heard it. A faint, metallic whirring sound, like gears grinding deep within the clock's mechanisms. The polished glass of the clock face rippled, as though it were water. I leaned closer, mesmerized, and caught a glimpse of something moving behind the glass. Something that shouldn't have been there. The reflection wasn't mine. It was a shadow, vaguely human but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its face an unreadable blur. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, and then its hand pressed against the inside of the glass. My breath caught as its fingers began to push through, stretching the glass outward like it was made of rubber. I stumbled back, knocking over a stack of books. The noise seemed to snap me out of my daze and the figure retreated, but before I could even process what I'd seen, the shop door creaked open. It was Mr. Hall. "I heard something. What's going on?" he asked, stepping toward the clock. "No!" I shouted, but it was too late. The clock struck midnight again, and the shop was filled with a deafening chime. I'll never forget what happened next. The glass face of the clock shattered outward, and a pair of shadowy arms reached out, grabbing Mr. Hall. He screamed as the shadows pulled him inside, his body vanishing into the swirling void within the clock. And then, silence. The clock's glass repaired itself in an instant as though nothing had happened. The pendulum resumed its steady ticking. Mr. Hall was gone. The police didn't believe me, of course. They dismissed Mr. Hall's disappearance as another unsolved case in a long line of mysteries. But I know what I saw. The clock was removed from the shop shortly after. No one knows where it went, but I still dream about it. Sometimes I hear its chime in the middle of the night, even though it's nowhere near me. And when I catch my reflection in mirrors, I swear I see something moving behind me, something waiting for its next strike. I've spent my career unraveling mysteries, but nothing prepared me for the terror I found in room 19. People didn't just disappear there. They left behind whispers, as if the walls themselves remembered their final moments. I arrived at the Hollow Pines Inn on a drizzling Tuesday afternoon, clutching my leather journal and recorder like talismans. The inn was quaint, almost charming in its neglect, peeling wallpaper, dim lighting, and the faint scent of mildew. But it was room 19 that had drawn me here, the room with a reputation for swallowing its occupants whole. I had read the stories: the traveling salesman in 1973, a young couple in 1988, and most recently, a grad student who'd been documenting the inn's history. Each checked in, left their luggage neatly packed, and vanished. No signs of struggle, no bodies, just strange, jagged scratches carved into the room's walls, as if by trembling hands. The innkeeper, Mrs. Calloway, was a frail woman with eyes like clouded marbles. She handed me the key to room 18 without asking questions, but when I brought up room 19, her lips pursed tightly. "We don't rent it anymore," she said, her voice a brittle whisper. "You shouldn't go in there." I ignored her. Curiosity is my curse. That night, as the rain battered the windows of room 18, I decided to investigate. The key to room 19 was nowhere to be found, but the door had a strange looseness to it, as though it wanted to be opened. With a slight push, the latch gave way, and I stepped inside. The air was suffocating, thick with an unplaceable scent, something between damp earth and burnt wood. The furniture was untouched. A bed with a sagging mattress, a wooden dresser, and a single chair facing the window. On the walls were the infamous scratches, but seeing them in person made my skin crawl. They weren't random. They formed fragmented words. "Help me. I see it. It's here." I leaned in closer, running my fingers over the indentations. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze, though the window was shut. The hairs on my neck stood on end, as a faint, raspy whisper filled the room. "Who's there?" I asked, spinning around. The room was empty, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I backed toward the door, but as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening thud. My heart raced as the whispering grew louder, incomprehensible and layered, like dozens of voices speaking over each other. I grabbed my recorder, fumbling to turn it on. "Is someone here?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. Silence, complete and smothering, enveloped the room. Then, from the corner near the chair, a shadow began to move. At first it was subtle, barely perceptible, but soon it grew, elongating and stretching toward me. "Get out," a voice growled, deep and guttural, nothing like the whispers before. I lunged for the door, yanking it open and stumbling back into the hallway. The light above room 19 flickered violently before the door slammed shut behind me. I spent the rest of the night in the lobby, unable to return to my room. Mrs. Calloway found me at dawn, her expression grim but unsurprised. "You heard it, didn't you?" she asked softly. "Who or what is in that room?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Her gaze drifted to the floor. "No one knows, but every person who stayed in room 19 heard the voices. They said it was watching them. Some couldn't resist staying longer, trying to figure it out." She paused. her frail hands trembling. None of them ever left. I didn't stay to learn more. I packed my things and left Hollow Pines Inn without looking back. But something followed me. No, not physically. At night, when I'm alone, I still hear the whispers, faint and distant. And every now and then I catch a glimpse of a shadow stretching across my walls, even when there's no light to cast it. They warned me not to follow the whispers, but curiosity has always been stronger than fear. If I'd known what waited in the shadows of those woods, I would have turned back that first night, or maybe I wouldn't have gone at all. I first heard the whispers when I moved into the cabin on the edge of Whispering Woods. The locals in town had been kind enough, but their smiles always faltered when I mentioned where I'd be staying. "You're braver than most," one man said quietly, but when I pressed him for details, he only shook his head and muttered something about the woods being wrong. I didn't believe in ghost stories or curses, so I ignored the warnings. The cabin was perfect for what I needed: isolation. Writing had become nearly impossible in the noise of the city, and the stillness of the forest was exactly what I craved. The first night, I barely noticed the sound, a faint murmuring that I assumed was the wind or the distant rustling of leaves. But as the nights wore on, the whispers grew clearer. At first I couldn't make out the words, just soft, rhythmic voices floating on the breeze. They always started at dusk and stopped at dawn. By the third night, I knew it wasn't the wind. The voices seemed to circle the cabin, growing louder when I stood near the windows. One night I left the porch light off and sat in the dark, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever, or whatever, was out there. But all I saw were the trees swaying gently, bathed in pale moonlight. Still, the whispers continued, now accompanied by faint laughter, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I told myself it was just my imagination, but curiosity gnawed at me. I needed to know. On the fifth night, armed with a flashlight and a heavy walking stick, I decided to follow the whispers into the woods. The sound seemed to pull me in, guiding me deeper with every step. The air grew colder the farther I went, and the trees seemed impossibly tall, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers overhead. "Is someone out there?" I called, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, a single voice broke the stillness, soft and clear, a woman's voice. "Help us." My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams across the trees. The voice repeated, closer this time. "Help us." I should have turned back, but I didn't. The voice sounded so desperate, so human. I stumbled forward, the ground soft and uneven beneath my feet. That's when I saw them. Figures stood among the trees, just barely visible in the faint light. At first, I thought they were people, but they didn't move like people. Their limbs were too long, their heads cocked at unnatural angles. They stood in absolute stillness, their hollow eyes reflecting the light like glass. One of them stepped forward, its movements jerky and disjointed. "Help us," it whispered again, but the voice was wrong, layered, like multiple people speaking in unison. I ran. The forest seemed endless as I sprinted back toward the cabin, the whispers now a deafening chorus behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the front door, slamming it shut and locking it behind me. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving me in suffocating silence. The next morning, I packed my things and left. When I reached the town, I tried to tell someone what I'd seen, but they just shook their heads and muttered about the woods being wrong. One old man finally spoke up. "You shouldn't have gone in," he said. "The ones who whisper, they're not people anymore. They haven't been for a long time." I sold the cabin and never went back, but the whispers stayed with me. Late at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear them, faint and pleading, "Help us." Some places aren't meant to be understood. Whispering Woods is one of them. The first time I heard about the abandoned subway station, I laughed it off as just another urban legend. By the time I stood in its depths, staring at claw marks on the tunnel walls, I wasn't laughing anymore. I've always had a fascination with the unexplained. When I read about the Pine subway station, an unfinished metro project buried beneath the city that had supposedly claimed the lives of construction workers in the 50s, I couldn't resist investigating. Locals claimed people who wandered down there vanished without a trace, their screams echoing through the empty tunnels long after they were gone. The entrance was sealed decades ago, but there were rumors of an access point through an old maintenance hatch. Armed with a flashlight, my phone, and a recorder, I made my way to the rusted, graffiti-covered hatch late one evening. The city above bustled with life, but down there, everything was silent, suffocatingly so. As I descended the narrow, crumbling staircase, the air grew colder, damp, and thick with a metallic tang. My flashlight flickered, the beam slicing through the pitch-black void. The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, its walls lined with faded posters and rusting pipes. I began to walk, my footsteps echoing unnervingly loud. The station's floor was littered with debris, broken tiles, rusted tools, and, oddly, shoes. Single mismatched shoes scattered along the ground, as though their owners had walked out of them, or been dragged. About 100 yards in, I noticed something strange. The shadows cast by my flashlight didn't seem to align with the objects around me. A pipe to my left stretched a shadow much farther than it should have. A pile of debris seemed to shift in the corner of my eye. I chalked it up to nerves, at first. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky but firm. It bounced back to me, distorted and warped. Then I heard it. A faint scuffling sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer. I swung my flashlight in every direction, but the beam seemed to shrink, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. I froze as the sound stopped, just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the shadow of a figure, unnaturally tall and thin, stretched impossibly long across the tunnel wall. I turned again, searching for the source, but the tunnel was empty. My breath came in shallow gasps as the shadow began to move, crawling along the wall toward me. "No," I whispered, stumbling backward. The shadow peeled itself off the wall, its form solidifying into a hunched, grotesque figure with limbs that bent in unnatural directions. Its head twisted toward me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze boring into me. I ran. My footsteps echoed wildly, the sound of something wet and heavy slapping the ground behind me. My flashlight flickered again, threatening to die as the air grew colder with every step. The tunnel felt endless, stretching farther the harder I ran. Then I tripped. My flashlight clattered across the ground, its beam illuminating a mass of claw marks etched deep into the wall beside me. Beneath the scratches, written in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "It watches, it waits, it takes." I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight, and bolted toward the faint outline of the maintenance hatch. I didn't dare look back, but I felt it. The heavy, suffocating presence just behind me. When I finally reached the hatch, I slammed it shut, the sound echoing through the night. I collapsed onto the street, trembling and gasping for air. I never went back. But, the nightmares never left. I still hear that wet, dragging sound in the quiet moments before sleep. And sometimes, in the corner of my room, I see shadows that don't belong, stretching toward me. Some tunnels should stay sealed forever. It's been years since the Ferris wheel at Ravenwood Carnival turned, but the laughter hasn't stopped. You can hear it at night, faint and distant, unless you get too close. Then it's deafening. When I first heard about Ravenwood Carnival, I thought it was just another urban legend, a place where people disappeared, their laughter echoing long after they were gone. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning curious visitors to stay far away. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. I arrived on a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air carries a bite. The carnival grounds were exactly as I'd imagined, desolate and overgrown. Rusting rides stood frozen in time, their vibrant colors faded into muted browns and grays. The Ferris wheel loomed above it all, its skeletal frame creaking in the wind. The first oddity was the silence. Despite the wind, not a single leaf rustled. It was the kind of quiet that wraps itself around you, thick and unnatural. Then, just as I stepped onto the grounds, I heard it. Laughter. It wasn't cheerful, though it tried to be. The sound was distorted, like an old record spinning just a little too slow. It came from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. My heart pounded, but I pressed on, clutching my flashlight like it could protect me. I wandered through the remnants of the carnival, the laughter growing louder with each step. A funhouse caught my eye, its once whimsical facade now peeling and decayed. The laughter seemed to call me toward it, pulling me in like a siren's song. Against every instinct, I entered. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, filled with the faint scent of rot. Mirrors lined the walls, most of them cracked and clouded with age. My reflection stared back at me from every angle, distorted and fragmented. But as I moved, I noticed something horrifying. One of the reflections didn't follow. It was a man dressed as an old-fashioned clown, his makeup smeared and eyes impossibly dark. He stood perfectly still in the mirror, his head tilted as if he were studying me. My chest tightened as I spun around, but the room behind me was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, he was gone. I stumbled out of the funhouse, gasping for air. The laughter was everywhere now, deafening and relentless. I ran toward the Ferris wheel, the towering centerpiece of the carnival. As I neared, I saw something moving in its shadow. Figures, dozens of them, their outlines faint and flickering like static on an old TV. They turned toward me in unison, their faces were blank, featureless masks of pale flesh. And yet, I could feel their eyes, their gazes piercing through me. "Join us," a voice whispered, though no lips moved. The figures began to advance, their movements jerky and unnatural. I backed away, my flashlight flickering wildly. The laughter reached a crescendo, overlapping screams and cries of terror, as if the carnival itself were alive, feeding on the fear of those who wandered in. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to my car, only that the laughter followed me the entire way. Even now, I hear it sometimes, faint and distant in the dead of night. The carnival may be abandoned, but it's far from empty, and if you hear the laughter, it might already be too late. When I checked into the Ravenwood Hotel, I didn't think twice about the key in my hand. But by morning, the room wasn't where I left it, and I wasn't the same person who had walked inside. The Ravenwood Hotel wasn't my first choice, but it was the only place with a vacancy on a rainy night in the middle of nowhere. The old man at the front desk barely looked up as he slid the key across the counter. "Room 304, he said in a monotone voice, his eyes lingering on the key for a moment before he added, "Stay inside after dark." I laughed nervously, assuming it was some small-town quirk. "Is it haunted?" I joked. He didn't laugh, or he didn't even blink. Just stay inside. The elevator creaked as it took me to the 3rd floor. The hallway was dim, lined with peeling wallpaper and flickering sconces. Room 304 was at the far end, its brass numbers tarnished and uneven. The key turned easily in the lock, and I stepped inside. It was a standard room, nothing special: a bed, a small desk, a chair, and a window overlooking the parking lot. But there was something about it that made me uneasy. The air felt too still, the silence too heavy. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to exhaustion, and climbed into bed after a quick shower. The rain outside lulled me to sleep, but I woke up sometime after midnight to an odd noise, a faint scraping sound, like furniture being dragged across the floor above me. I frowned. There wasn't supposed to be anyone on the 4th floor. The clerk had mentioned it was under renovation. The scraping stopped as abruptly as it started. I told myself it was nothing and forced myself back to sleep. When I woke the next morning, something was off. The sunlight streaming through the window felt colder, sharper, and when I looked outside, the parking lot was gone. In its place was a sprawling, misty forest. Confused, I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was 7 a.m., but there was no signal. When I stepped out into the hallway, I froze. It wasn't the same hallway. The walls were darker, the wallpaper shredded in places. The flickering sconces were replaced by strange rusted lanterns that barely lit the corridor. The air was thick, metallic, and the door to room 304 was no longer behind me. I turned a corner and saw a man standing at the end of the hallway. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his face obscured by the dim light. "Excuse me," I called, relief flooding me at the sight of another person. "Can you help me?" He didn't move, didn't even react. I took a step closer and his head snapped toward me so fast I stumbled backward. His face wasn't human. His eyes were hollow, his mouth stretched impossibly wide. He let out a guttural sound and started walking toward me. No, not walking, gliding. Panic surged through me as I bolted in the opposite direction. Doors lined the hallway, each one numbered differently than before. 202, 415, 509. But they didn't match the floor I'd been on. I tried several handles, but none of the doors would open. The man's footsteps echoed behind me, steady and relentless. Finally, I reached a door marked "Exit." I threw it open and found myself in the same hallway I'd just left. "No," I whispered, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The lights dimmed further, and the air grew colder. The whispers started then, faint but unmistakable, coming from the walls themselves. "Stay inside. Stay inside." Desperate, I flung myself against a door marked 104, and it opened. I slammed it shut behind me and turned to find myself in a room identical to the one I'd left, room 304. The whispers stopped. The next morning, I packed my bags and fled the hotel without looking back. The clerk at the desk wasn't the same old man from the night before. This one was younger, and his face was blank, as though he hadn't slept in years. "I hope you had a pleasant stay," he said in the same monotone voice. I didn't respond. Months have passed since that night, but I can't stop thinking about the Ravenwood Hotel. Every time I look in the mirror, I notice something different. A wrinkle that wasn't there before, a strand of white hair. The nights are the worst, though, because sometimes I wake up to find myself back in room 304, and I'm afraid that one day I won't wake up at all. Some doors should never be opened, and some places should never be found. The night the sky split open, it felt like the world had drawn its last breath. At first, we thought it was just another storm, until the stars disappeared and the darkness began to move. I was out on the porch when it happened, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and watching the clouds roll in. The air felt heavier than usual, like the sky was pressing down on us. The crickets, usually loud this time of year, had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It started with a sound, low and guttural, like the groan of shifting earth. I looked up just in time to see it, the sky tearing open, jagged and uneven, like someone had ripped through black fabric. Behind the tear wasn't the usual star-speckled void of space. It was something else entirely, a deep, swirling nothingness that seemed to pulse, alive and watching. The first scream came from the house next door. Old Mr. Hanley stumbled out onto his lawn, clutching his head. "Don't look at it!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "Close your eyes. Don't let it see you." But it was too late for him. He dropped to his knees, his face frozen in a silent scream, staring up at the crack as his body went limp. I should have run inside then, slammed the door, locked it and hid, but I couldn't move. My gaze was locked on the sky. The edges of the crack writhed like they were alive, and the darkness within seemed to seep outward, spreading like ink into the clouds. My neighbor Lily ran out from her house, her toddler in her arms. "What's happening?" she shouted, tears streaming down her face. I wanted to answer, but my throat felt like it had closed. She made the mistake of looking up, and her scream was worse than anything I'd ever heard. She turned and bolted back into her house, slamming the door behind her. The crack pulsed, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving inside it, a shape, massive and twisting, impossible to fully comprehend. The darkness seemed to spill down from the sky, like tendrils reaching for the ground. That's when the voices started. Soft at first, like whispers carried on the wind, but they grew louder, overlapping, endless, and in no language I could recognize. They weren't coming from outside. They were in my head. "You can't escape," one said, cold and echoing. "We see you now," another added, the tone almost mocking. I stumbled backward into the house, slamming the doors shut and pulling the curtains tight. But it didn't help. The voices were inside, burrowing deeper into my mind with every passing second. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The power went out, plunging the house into darkness. I lit a candle, its flickering light barely holding back the shadows that seemed to move on their own. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I grabbed it, desperate for connection. There was a message from Lily. "It's inside the house. Don't let it touch you." A noise came from the hallway, soft, like something dragging across the floor. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. There, in the shadows, was a figure. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its form was shifting, constantly changing, as if it couldn't decide what shape to take. Its eyes, or what I thought were eyes, glowed faintly, two pinpricks of light in the darkness. The whispers in my head grew louder as it moved closer. "Join us," they said. "See what lies beyond." I ran to the bedroom, slamming the door and shoving a dresser in front of it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the candle. The whispers were deafening now, like 1,000 voices screaming at once. Outside, the crack in the sky seemed to widen, the edges stretching farther apart. More of the darkness spilled out, swallowing the stars, the moon, and eventually, the world itself. I don't know how long I've been here, hiding in the dark. The whispers are still there, softer now, but constant. They tell me things I can't repeat, things about the world, about what's beyond it, and about what's coming. The crack hasn't closed. It's still there, somewhere above me, waiting. And I can't help but feel like it's watching me, waiting for me to look up again. Some doors should never be opened. The sky wasn't meant to crack. The journal was brittle with age, the ink smudged, but the words still carried the weight of madness. "It rises from the sea," the keeper had written in shaky letters. "And soon, it will take me too." The lighthouse stood like a solitary sentinel on the jagged cliffs of Blackthorn Point, its beacon long extinguished. They called it the Widow's Light, named for the countless sailors who had met their end in the icy waters below. When I arrived to document its history for my book on maritime legends, I didn't expect to find much more than crumbling stone and rusted gears. The locals were eager to share their tales, too eager almost. Every story they told had the same unnerving theme. The keeper disappeared without a trace. Not a single one of them knew his name, but they all remembered the day the light went dark. The townsfolk had gone to investigate, only to find the tower abandoned. No sign of a struggle, no body. Just the light extinguished, and his quarters eerily undisturbed. It was the journal that changed everything. I found it in a dusty drawer tucked beneath the keeper's rickety bed, buried under yellowed papers and sea charts. The leather cover was cracked, the pages damp from years of sea air. But the entries were still legible. They started out mundane, weather reports, maintenance logs. But then, halfway through, the tone shifted. April 3rd. The fog returned today, thick and black, like oil. It wasn't on the horizon this time. It was circling the tower. I swear I heard voices coming from it, faint but persistent. I told myself it was just the wind, but I'm not sure I believe that. April 5th, the voices were louder tonight. They called my name. How could they know my name? Reading those words sent a chill down my spine. But I dismissed them as the ramblings of an isolated man, slowly succumbing to loneliness. It wasn't until I spent my first night in the lighthouse that I began to understand. The fog rolled in just before midnight, as thick and black as the journal described. The air turned bitterly cold, and the world outside the window vanished into an inky void. That's when I heard it, faint at first, like a low hum. It wasn't the wind. I stepped outside onto the balcony, clutching a flashlight. The beam barely penetrated the fog, but I could feel something out there, watching. The hum grew louder, shifting into something almost human. The voices were garbled, overlapping, as though dozens of people were whispering all at once. Then I heard it clearly, my name. "Oh, is there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The fog churned, swirling like a living thing, and then, for just a moment, I saw it. A massive shape lurking in the darkness, its outline barely discernible. It was too big to be human, too solid to be a trick of the light. My flashlight flickered, and the thing disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. The next morning, I combed through the journal again, desperate for answers. Toward the end, the entries became frantic, almost illegible. April 15th. It doesn't want the light. It wants me. I can feel it now, even in the daylight. Watching, waiting. April 20th. I hear it in my dreams. It shows me the depths, endless, dark, and cold. It's calling me home. The final entry was just 3 words, scrawled in bold, uneven strokes. I opened it. I didn't know what he meant by it, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I packed my things and left that afternoon, the journal tucked tightly under my arm. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the lighthouse shrink into the distance. The fog was creeping in again, but this time I saw something moving within it. Something enormous, coiling and twisting like a serpent in the waves. I haven't been able to sleep since. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the voices calling my name, and sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I see the fog pooling outside my window. Some lights should stay extinguished, and some depths should never be disturbed.